The witch hunts. Dark curses and torture in medieval times in the dim corridors of history. There are few chapters as chilling and unforgettable as the witch hunts of medieval Europe. These were not merely legal proceedings or isolated bursts of violence. They were sweeping storms of fear that consumed entire communities, fueled by superstition, religious dogma, and a desperate need to explain the inexplicable. The witch hunts became a stage where suspicion turned neighbor against neighbor, and whispers carried the weight of death. To be accused of witchcraft was to stand at the edge of the abyss, where your fate could be decided not by truth, but by terror. The Middle Ages were an era steeped in mystery, a world lit dimly by flickering candles and haunted by the constant presence of plague, famine, and war. In a time where science was scarce and miracles were demanded of faith, the unknown often took on the face of the supernatural. A bad harvest might be blamed on a curse, a sudden illness on a hex, and an untimely death on the invisible hand of witchcraft. To explain suffering, people searched not within the natural world, but in the shadows of the occulted, so the figure of the witch emerged as the embodiment of fear itself. The Church, desperate to maintain authority over restless souls, declared that witchcraft was not just superstition, but heresy, a pact with the devil himself. In sermons and manuals like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, witches were described as women who flew at night, consorted with demons, and poisoned the faithful with malice. This demonization gave birth to hysteria, and hysteria gave birth to violence. Trials swept across Europe like wildfire, from the German states to France, from Scotland to the far corners of Eastern Europe, dragging thousands of accused women and some men into the depths of torment. Yet behind the veil of piety lay darker motives. The witch hunts were not only about religion. They were also about power, greed, and control. To accuse someone of witchcraft was to rid oneself of an enemy, to seize land, to silence dissent. Entire communities were reshaped by fear, with accusations spreading through villages like infection. And once suspicion touched your name, escape was nearly impossible. Under torture, confessions flowed like blood, each word forced from cracked lips and broken bodies. The instruments of medieval cruelty, the rack, the thumbscrew, the witch's bridle were wielded in the name of salvation, but they left behind only scars and silence. What made the witch hunt so terrifying was not only the brutality of the punishments, but the ease with which ordinary life could be transformed into a nightmare. A glance, a rumor, a misfortune any, could brand you as a witch. For the accused there was no true defense, for evidence was twisted, and even denial was seen as proof of guilt. To live under such a system was to live with the constant awareness that the devil's shadow might fall on anyone, anywhere, at any time. This episode in human history reveals the darkest corners of the medieval mind, where curses were feared as weapons, rituals as gateways to damnation, and torture as the pathway to truth. It is a reminder of how fragile justice becomes when fear governs judgment, and how quickly civilization can cloak barbarity in the garments of faith. The witch hunts were not only a war against supposed witches, they were a war against humanity's own hunger for control, its dread of the unknown, and its insatiable thirst for power. Tonight, we open the ancient book of horrors and turn to the chapter written in fire, chains, and whispered curses. This is the story of the witch hunts, dark trials, forbidden rituals, and the tortured cries that still echoed through the ruins of medieval Europe. The fear of the witch in the medieval imagination, fear was never far from daily life. Crops failed without warning, plagues swept through villages, and war left smoldering ruins across the land. When disaster struck, explanations were demanded, and in the absence of science, suspicion filled the void. It was in this darkness that the figure of the witch emerged, an embodiment of all that was uncanny, threatening, and unseen. The fear of witches was not simply fear of individuals. It was fear of chaos itself, given a human face. To the ordinary villager, the witch was rarely a stranger. She was the lonely widow at the edge of town, the healer with unorthodox remedies, the woman who refused to bend to authority. Her difference was her crime, and difference was dangerous. A cow's sudden death, a child's mysterious fever, even the storm that flattened a harvest could all be laid at her door. Fear demanded a culprit, and the witch was always close at hand. The church fanned these flames of dread with sermons that thundered from pulpits across Europe. Priests warned of witches consorting with demons under the cover of night, gathering in secret covens to blaspheme the sacraments and plot the ruin of Christendom. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum painted witches as agents of Satan, seducing men, cursing infants, and spreading pestilence with whispered incantations. To fear witches was not only natural, it was righteous, a defense of the soul against the devil's servants. But behind this terror lay deeper anxieties. Women, in particular, became the focus of witchcraft accusations, not only because of superstition, but because society viewed them as more vulnerable to temptation, more likely to fall into sin. Misogyny merged with theology to create a toxic vision, woman as both weak vessel and dangerous corrupter. Thus, the fear of witches was also the fear of women's independence, sexuality, and hidden power. In persecuting witches, medieval society sought to control the unpredictable force of female agency. Fear also served political ends. Leaders and magistrates knew that an enemy defined as invisible and omnipresent could unite communities under their authority. To denounce witches was to reaffirm loyalty to church and crown, to demonstrate vigilance against evil. The witch became a scapegoat, not just for misfortune, but for the insecurities of rulers who feared dissent. Populace terrified of witchcraft was easier to govern, easier to silence, easier to exploit. Yet the terror was never abstract. It lived in whispers between neighbors, in glances that lingered too long, in the silence that followed when a woman entered a room. Fear of the witch turned villages into nests of suspicion, where trust dissolved and betrayal became a weapon of survival. To live in such a world was to live with the constant awareness that your life could collapse with a single accusation. Fear was the invisible noose, always waiting to tighten. What made this fear so powerful was its blend of the real and the imagined. People genuinely believed they had seen curses at work, milk curdling, animals limping, shadows moving in the night. Dreams and nightmares carried as much weight as evidence, for in the medieval mind, the boundary between natural and supernatural was thin and fragile. The witch was both neighbor and phantom, both woman and monster. To accuse her was to strike at the source of unease, to banish the chaos that haunted every hearth. In the end, the fear of the witch was not about witches at all, it was about humanity's attempt to wrestle control from a terrifying world. It was about turning suffering into a story, misfortune into blame, and dread into an enemy that could be named, hunted, and destroyed. Yet in naming that enemy, societies unleashed a new terror, one that stalked the innocent, tore families apart, and left Europe echoing with cries of despair. The witch embodied fear, but it was fear itself, more than any spell, that truly cursed the Middle Ages. Trials and torture, if fear of witches poisoned the air of medieval Europe, the trials were the crucible where that fear hardened into cruelty. To be accused was to be condemned long before any verdict was pronounced. The courtroom was not a place of justice. It was a theater of dread, a stage where superstition, power, and pain played their roles with merciless precision. The trials themselves often began with rumor and ended with screams. Accusations rarely required proof. Suspicion, gossip, or the testimony of a frightened child could summon the machinery of judgment. Once accused, a person was stripped not only of freedom but of humanity. Their body became the battleground upon which truth would be discovered. In the twisted logic of the time, torture was not cruelty but revelation, a divine instrument to force hidden sins into the light. The methods were as varied as they were horrific. The infamous witch's bridle clamped iron across a woman's head, forcing a spiked bit into her mouth, tearing flesh and silencing her forever. To silence a supposed witch was to silence defiance, for words themselves were seen as weapons of curses. The ducking stool, equally brutal, chained victims to a chair and plunged them repeatedly into freezing rivers. If they drowned, they were declared innocent before God. If they survived, the devil was said to be protecting them, sealing their guilt. It was a test without escape, a ritual of death disguised as justice. Even more chilling were the confessions extracted on the rack, where limbs were stretched until joints shattered and tendons snapped. Each scream, each gasp was treated as evidence of pact-making with Satan. Under such agony, the people confessed to anything, flying through the night, feasting with demons, cursing crops and children. The truth did not matter. Only the performance of guilt mattered, a script written in pain and signed with blood. Public executions often followed these trials, turning fear into spectacle. Crowds gathered to witness the burning of the condemned, the flames consuming not only bodies but any lingering doubts. These executions reinforced the message: the world was haunted by witches, and only through fire and torment could purity be restored. Yet the deeper truth was far darker. These acts served power, not piety. They tightened the church's grip, eliminated dissent, and reminded every villager that authority held the right to define sin and wield death. The cruelty of these trials reveals more about the society that created them than the women and men they condemned. In torturing supposed witches, medieval Europe tortured itself, displaying its fear, its hunger for control, and its willingness to sacrifice justice at the altar of superstition. Each rack, each bridle, each drowning was not just a punishment, but a mirror reflecting the darkest impulses of the age. And in that mirror, humanity saw not witches, but its own monstrous reflection. Dark rituals and forbidden curses. If the trials were fueled by terror, then the image of the witch's ritual was the nightmare that haunted the medieval imagination. In the popular mind, witches did not simply whisper curses in secret, they gathered in wild, unholy assemblies, where darkness itself was invoked as a weapon against the faithful. These imagined gatherings, later called Sabbaths, became the focus of fear and fascination, blending folklore, superstition, and deliberate invention by churchmen eager to feed the flames of hysteria. In these stories, witches met under the pale light of the moon, in forests or abandoned ruins, dancing in circles, chanting incantations, and offering unholy sacrifices. It was said they smeared themselves with ointments brewed from strange herbs, blood, and the fat of the dead. With such potions, they claimed the ability to fly through the night sky, leaving trails of fire behind them as they rode broomsticks or twisted demons in the form of animals. These images were passed from one village to another, embroidered with each retelling, until they became evidence of a world secretly ruled by shadow. At the center of these imagined rituals stood the devil himself, not as a vague presence but as a figure to be adored and obeyed. Confessions extracted under torture painted vivid pictures: witches kneeling before a black-clad demon, kissing his hoof in mockery of the cross, swearing loyalty with their blood. Some spoke of feasts where foul meats were consumed, where infants were sacrificed, where lust was indulged without restraint. These confessions, though forced and fantastical, etched lasting horrors into the collective memory, convincing entire societies that they were locked in a war with an invisible enemy. But beyond the grotesque inventions, there were real practices of folk magic that fed these fears. Herbal remedies, charms to ward off sickness, whispered prayers for fertility innocent, acts of survival in a harsh world were often twisted into signs of diabolical power. A midwife who used herbs to ease childbirth might be accused of invoking forbidden forces. A farmer who muttered blessings over his fields could be branded a sorcerer. The thin line between superstition and heresy was constantly shifting, and ordinary people often found themselves crushed beneath it. Curses, too, were deeply feared, not because they were proven, but because belief in them was unshakable. A single word spoken in anger, a gesture made at the wrong time, could be seen as a hex. Victims of such imagined curses believed themselves doomed, their health failing, their fortunes collapsing, all because a neighbor had muttered against them. Fear of the curse was often stronger than any actual harm, creating a self-fulfilling cycle that only reinforced the power of suspicion. What made these tales of ritual and curse so enduring was their allure. They explained the unexplainable, gave shape to invisible terrors, provided a narrative in which evil could be confronted and destroyed. But they also allowed the powerful to control the powerless. By inventing stories of forbidden rituals, authorities justified brutal crackdowns. By spreading dread of curses, they tightened their grip on a fearful populace. Rituals may have been imagined, but their consequences were brutally real. In the end, the legacy of these dark rituals is not one of truth, but of storytelling. They reveal how fear creates its own monsters, how myth can become weapon, and how societies can be driven to madness by the shadows they themselves cast. To medieval Europe, the witch's curse was a living threat, but in truth, it was the curse of fear, the most enduring, most destructive, and most human curse of all. Legacy of fear, the witch hunts of the Middle Ages were more than a series of trials and executions. They were a vast shadow cast across centuries, a warning of what happens when fear replaces reason and superstition rules over truth. The flames that consumed the accused may have died long ago, but the echoes of their screams still linger in the ruins of forgotten villages and in the dark corners of our cultural memory. What endures most is not the witches themselves, but the fear that created them. Fear of famine, fear of illness, fear of difference. These anxieties demanded an outlet, and the figure of the witch became the perfect vessel. In scapegoating women and outsiders, medieval society believed it was purging evil. But in reality, it was exposing its own fragility. The witch trials reveal how quickly justice collapses when driven by hysteria, and how cruelty thrives when cloaked in the garments of piety. The legacy also lives on in the instruments of torture that remain in museums today. Mute reminders of a time when human bodies were broken in search of impossible truths. Visitors shudder at the sight of the rack, the bridle, the ducking stool, not only for their brutality, but for what they symbolize: the human capacity to justify horror in the name of salvation. These devices are not relics of witches, but of human fear, sharpened into iron and wood. Culturally, the witch has never vanished. From Gothic literature to modern cinema, she endures as both victim and villain, an icon of forbidden power and persecuted difference. The witch's curse, once whispered in terror, is now retold in stories, films, and myths that still draw audiences into the same dark fascination that haunted the medieval imagination. In her image, we see not only superstition, but resilience, the survival of those who carried forbidden knowledge, those who defied silence, those who embodied the fears of their time yet refused to be forgotten. Perhaps the most haunting legacy is the mirror the witch hunts hold up to our own age. The names and accusations may change, but the mechanisms of fear remain familiar. When societies search for scapegoats in times of crisis, when suspicion spreads faster than truth, when authority uses terror to maintain control, the shadows of the witch hunts return. They remind us that hysteria is not confined to history. It is a human weakness, always waiting to be kindled. The witch hunts were, at their heart, a war against the unknown. Yet in waging that war, medieval Europe revealed the darkest truths about itself: its fear of women, its hunger for control, its fragile grip on justice. And so, the legacy of the witch is not a tale of demons and curses, but of humanity's endless struggle with its own shadows. Tonight, as we close the book on this chapter of fire and fear, we are left with a question. Have we truly moved beyond the darkness, or do we still carry the witch's curse within us?